the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and the Republic of Korea, are there signs of rapprochement between the two after the past year of heightened tensions over THAAD? And with terrorist attacks continuing relentlessly across Europe, we'll be asking what are the reasons behind such high number of incidents and whether an end to such attacks is in sight. Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and the Republic of Korea. However, instead of high-level visits or grand ceremonies, the anniversary has been marred by a year of tensions between the two countries. China and ROK relations have been on a roller coaster ride since the establishment of diplomatic ties in 1992 to the honeymoon period in 2015 and then to the current tension caused by the ROK's decision to deploy a U.S. missile shield called THAAD the following year. So the ROK and the U.S. claim that the THAAD system is solely aimed at inbound missiles from the DPRK, but China strongly objects to the deployment, saying that it will undercut its strategic security interests. The 25th anniversary of diplomatic ties also comes on the heels of the first 100 days in office of the new ROK President Moon Jae-in. What's been Moon's attitude towards the THAAD deployment? How has that impacted bilateral ties, and what could be done to put bilateral ties back on a healthy track? I'm pleased to be joined in our studio by Professor Su Hao from the China Foreign Affairs University and in New York by Professor Sung Yoon Lee from the Tufts University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Su, now the two presidents sent congratulatory messages to each other, and President Xi said on Thursday in his message that he is ready to make concerted efforts with his South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in to properly address the differences between the two countries. Now, according to the official Yonhap news agency, President Moon assessed in his message that their bilateral relations have seen significant advance and expressed hopes that Seoul-Beijing ties that he cherishes will further develop in a substantial strategic cooperative one. In terms of the state of bilateral ties, where are we right now? Are we seeing any signs of the two sides warming up towards each other?
Well, we know that China and South Korean relations are quite mature after the 25th anniversary of this our development, between our two countries. So regarding our bilateral relations, it's quite good, in the past 25 years. But we know that because the THAAD issue in the past years, so make our bilateral relations cool down. But I would say that we can still keep the high level of our bilateral relations. We know that in the diplomatic tradition in the international community, 10 years could be the full scale, the large scale of celebration for the bilateral relations, and 5 years could be I would say that's media scale of the celebration for this bilateral relations. So this year could be the 25th years for our bilateral relations establishment. So I think it was very important years for us to enhance our bilateral relations with each other.
Yeah. Professor Lee, what is the South Korean perspective of the current state of bilateral ties? Are we peaked? Have we peaked in our coldness? Are we about to turn to warming up? Or is things going to go even further on our entrenched positions?
I am sure better times lie ahead in the bilateral relationship. I remember in the days, weeks, months leading up to August 24th, 1992, the day that the normalization treaty was signed, there was great excitement in South Korea, even a sense of euphoria. Koreans, South Koreans, and North Koreans are romantically attached to China, and there are cultural, historical reasons, of course, but also in modern history, in the first half of the 20th century, when Korea was Japan's colony, there were no formal relations between Korea and China, and in the second half of the 20th century, since the founding of the People's Republic of China, South Korea and China, of course, had fraught relations during the Cold War. So the for South Korea to win China back, if you will, as it did in 1992, was a landmark occasion. And over the past quarter century, trade relations, people-to-people relations have grown dramatically. Back then, there were maybe a few tens of thousands of visitors from China to Korea and vice versa. Now, there are more than 10 million a year. And bilateral trade is well over 200 billion, with South Korea enjoying a trade surplus, one of few nations to enjoy a trade surplus with China. So that makes South Korea somewhat economically dependent on China and also culturally very favorably disposed toward China.
Yeah, Professor Su, there are some people sharing the kind of concern that, look, China and the ROK are two countries that are very different in size. And some people in the ROK might fear that China does not value the relationship with the ROK as much as they might do the other way around. What is the, how much importance does the China, for instance, put in this bilateral relationship?
Well, we know that in the Northeast Asia, South Korea is very important regarding the regional security, sub-regional security in Northeast Asia, and of course the economic relation between China and South Korea, and of course the regional economic cooperation. So South Korea has an important economy in the East Asia. So China has paid much importance on our relation with the South Korea, because we share quite a lot of economic development with each other. So economically, in particular, the trade relation between China and the South Korea. So we are interdependent with each other quite a lot. So the reason why, even though China and South Korea have some kind of the security problem, like the THAAD issue, but economically, in particular, the trade issue, China and South Korea, we also keeping our increasing with each other regarding our scale of the trade unities.
Professor Lee, now talking about the THAAD system, while President Moon has sent no clear messages in his position in dealing with THAAD, however, on July the 28th, he ordered his aides to consult with their U.S. counterparts about the deployment of 4 additional launches of THAAD, saying this was a response to the DPRK's test launch of a ballistic missile. Can we take it as his position on THAAD that the deployment should go ahead? Remember, when he was just taking office, he was talking about due procedure and environmental assessment before the deployment can officially go ahead.
Well, the deployment of THAAD in South Korea is increasingly looking like a fait accompli, irreversible even, but I don't think so. We know that Moon Jae-in is very much pro-China. When he served as the chief of staff for a former South Korean president, Roh Moo-hyun, between 2003 and 2008, in those days, South Korea actually declared that South Korea will henceforth pursue a policy of equidistance between Beijing and Washington, that South Korea will try to play the role of the balancer in the region, which was a not so thinly veiled message to Washington. If you get us entangled in a war started by the United States, no thank you, we don't want any part of it. So we know that Mr. Moon, when he campaigned, he was against deployment of THAAD. And in recent weeks, of course, North Korea's continual threats and provocations have made it difficult for the Moon administration to reverse THAAD. But I would say if North Korea returns to talks, presents the South with an olive branch, if there is a resumption of dialogue between the two Koreas, I think the dynamics could change dramatically, and the question of THAAD will come to the fore once again, perhaps in China's favor.
Now, Professor Su, what is your response to that? Now that the DPRK has been reported to have produced militarized nuclear warhead and successfully conducted intercontinental ballistic missile tests, does that justify it? Does that make the case stronger for the ROK to have THAAD? Has China's position changed in recent months?
Well, DPRK's nuclear issue and the THAAD issue in South Korea, which is the different issues between China and North Korea and South Korea. I would say that, of course, DPRK's nuclear programs and launches the ballistic missiles make the problem in the Northeast Asia security situation. So both China and South Korea facing their, somehow the challenges from the North Korea. So we share the common security ground regarding their, manages the security problem from North Korea. But We can say that because the North Koreans' problems, then China will be, reduce our concerns about the third issue. Because the third issue is the real issue, which is the posted threat, security threat to China. Of course, based upon the Americans, deployment, the threat on South Korea's soil. So even though there's the problem from the north, but for China, we still pay importance on the third issues so that we can have still our, political concern and security concerns, and try to persuade the South Korea to take their, cautious actions regarding its behaviors on the third issues. So I think that's which is a different issue between the two issues.
Mm-hmm. In the face of greater threats from the DPRK, Professor Lee, President Moon has said that he will never allow war on the Korean Peninsula, which is also China's position. What kind of opportunity do you think China and ROK can collaborate together in order to work for peace and stability on the peninsula, meanwhile warming up their ties?
Well, in a geopolitical, historical sense, China and South Korea and North Korea have a common bond, which is the yet-to-be-resolved issue, the thorny issue of Japanese imperial aggression in the first half of the 20th century, and the reckoning, the historical memory, and any kind of compensation or admission of state culpability on the part of Tokyo, which is not forthcoming, of course. When President Xi visited South Korea, for example, in 2014, in July, President Xi mentioned a historical war in which the Chinese and Koreans fought against a common enemy, shoulder to shoulder, referring to Hideyoshi's invasion in the 1590s. But then in more recent history, of course, there was a honeymoon period between President Xi and Park Geun-hye, the ousted South Korean, the former president, because Japan's whitewashing of history, the two nations came very close together, even building a memorial to a Korean patriot who killed a Japanese statesman, Ito Hirobumi, in Harbin. So, those issues will bring China and South Korea closer together once North Korea really gets off this stampede, this continual bluster barrage. I think the opportunity is there for South Korea and China to mend fences and to cooperate together on a host of issues. There is genuine Sinophilism, love and admiration for China in South Korea. There is no organized anti-Chinese movement,
yes,
anti-Chinese protests, whereas there are, of course, those with respect to the US and Japan.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have to leave it there. Professor of the China Foreign Affairs University and Professor Sun Yun Lee from the Tufts University. And here is my first point. According to ROK statistics, two-way trade grew 30-fold in the past 25 years and personnel changes grew 70-fold. Before bilateral ties were affected by the thought issue, there were on a weekly basis 1,400 flights connecting cities on both sides. One example of how close the people-to-people relationship has been. Hopefully, with concerted efforts, we'll understand each other's concerns better and take the interests of both sides into account in our policy making. You're watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back right after this. While France, Germany, Belgium, Britain have yet to recover from a number of terrorist attacks since 2015, we have been witnessing more bloody attacks in Spain's Barcelona and Cambrils and in Finland's Turku. On Wednesday, police in the Netherlands detained the driver of a van carrying gas bottles as a concert by a US rock band in Rotterdam was cancelled earlier in the day. Why do terrorist attacks happen one after another in Europe these days? Has terrorism really become the new normal for European cities? I'm pleased to be joined from Rome by Francesco Sisci, Senior Researcher at the Center for European Studies of Rome University, and in Beijing by Professor Feng Zhongping, Vice President at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Feng, a former chief of a French security force, said at the moment there is an attack every 4 to 6 weeks in Europe. Why are terrorist attacks happening one after another in Europe lately?
Well, it's a sad fact, every month, almost every month is one terrorist attack in Europe. Is really very sad. Europe was a very peaceful place. People, had long believed this. I think, people have frequently asked me, what's the reason every time after attacks in Paris, in Britain, this time in Spain. I think there are two reasons, major reasons. Number one, the rise of so-called Islamic State group in the Middle East is definitely have a direct impact in the frequent happening of this terrorist attack. Secondly, I think probably more importantly, it is the reason we have to think about what is going on inside the individual European countries, in Spain, for example, in the UK, France. I think that we have to notice the very important fact, which is the radicalization of the young people, because we saw, this is not a secret, hundreds of young people from Paris, from UK, goes to so-called Islamic State. So this is the two reasons I think should be responsible.
And actually, some of them have also become radicalized in Europe. Mr. Sishi, now the perpetrators of the Barcelona attack, for instance, have been Muslims of North African origin, and according to reports, they have been most likely radicalized in Europe without having traveled to the Middle East. So is there a trend developing there? Is Spain any different from other European countries in this regard?
Well, I think it is in general. We see a general problem in many European countries of radicalization of young immigrants. And these immigrants are actually not real immigrants, but second generation, even third generation. We see it in Spain, we see it in France, we see it in England, where this trend of immigration has been oldest in a way. And this is a problem of integration, I think. These people feel not integrated and therefore go back to their origin, or what they think is their origin. And then there is this problem of radicalization. So I would say there is a short-term and a long-term measures to be taken. One is integrate more these people, this second, third generation, where there is more of a problem. And then, of course, there is the short-term problem, which is more control of the territory, more control of the mosques, which organize and set up these terrorist attacks.
Professor Feng, we have seen this wave of terrorist attacks basically starting from the beginning of 2015, when we noticed at increasing frequency these, such kind of attacks. Are we approaching the peaking of this wave, or is this going to be, for the next years, the new reality for Europe?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I guess the economic globalization, the consequences of this, negative consequences of the economic globalization, particularly the 2008 international financial crisis, has had a very negative impact in many Western countries, in European countries especially, because also the debt crisis. So the gap between the rich and the poor is widening, and the people who are mostly hated, hated on the Sisi has just mentioned the second or even third generation of immigrations. So if you want to think about these roots, to reduce this root, it's going to be a long-term challenge for European countries. But I guess, with the increasing frequency you mentioned of the terrorist attacks, the security forces and intelligence forces of the European countries are also, working very hard. So I guess, let's look at, wait and say what this is going to last for how long?
Mr. Sishi, what's your prediction? We also see the situation on the ground in the Middle East, in Syria, for instance, the IS losing more and more territories. Are we going to see more such attacks in the future in Europe because of the fact that they're losing territory in the Middle East, or are we going to see gradually the IS dying out because of their losing in the Middle East?
I would agree totally with Professor Feng. A, is hard to predict. B, the IS and the radicalization is an excuse in many ways. I mean, these guys have no connections in Europe, really, with places in Iraq, in Syria. And if they were to go back, I would say that they would find it very hard to go there. And we know that some people went back and they are used as cannon fodders because the people on the territory don't trust these young radicals. So there is a problem of radicalization because there is a problem of disparity between rich and poor, as Professor Feng was saying, but there is also a problem of integration, cultural integration. These people are no longer the traditional Muslims, and they are not integrated, they don't feel integrated in the modern Western European society. There is an effort to be made there, and unfortunately I think it will take a long time, years, maybe even more decades.
Professor Feng, speaking of the terrorist attack in Spain, the Spanish police said the terrorists had been preparing bigger attacks, but they ended up with adopting a more rudimentary plan, the van rampage, because of the terrorist accidental blast the day before. Compared with previous terrorist attacks, when one individual terrorist acted alone, there's a group of 12 terrorists this time who may have been involved in the attack in Spain. Some Western media said there is a change from lone wolf attacks to group of wolves attacks. What's your take?
I think we have to prepare, people in Europe have to prepare for these two types of attacks. Not just either lonely wolf, as people call, or group of wolves. I think they can happen, in both ways, in different countries. In the UK, for example, in the same years, probably same month, we saw two kinds of attacks. But this time, in Spain, indeed, we saw there is a group, it's a terror cell, has been working for long years. But this tells us, Europe is a very interesting place. One point is certainly this, international terrorist group has been made Europe as a target, major target. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, there is some problem, in Europe, because within the European Union, there is no board among individual countries. So what that means, that means one terrorist attack can travel from one country to another easily. And this is a big problem. And so this encourages, all kinds of different attacks, which includes, attacks by a group, because they can travel from one country to another.
Yeah, and also it seems that they have learned, they have copied from what they have seen on the news. This kind of trucks ramming into buildings seems to be the most, easy way to wreak maximum havoc. Mr. Sishi, how do you look at the current trend of maybe multiple perpetrators and increasingly using this kind of van rampage tactic?
Right. On the one hand, this is good news because that means that they don't have access to weapons. That is, there is a low quality of organization. Weapons means people that have to be trained, weapons that have to be smuggled. It means bigger organization, more money. The fact that they cannot access to weapons and they have to manufacture bombs, as they tried to do in Barcelona, it means that actually the repression is quite effective. However, as you were saying, the copycat effect, the idea that it's so easy to attack somebody just with a car, with a van, with a truck, that makes it very, very hard to avoid, to prevent this kind of attacks in the future. But there is also a good sense here. The fact that now we have more people organizing. More people means that if the intelligence in Europe were to collaborate more, as Professor Feng was suggesting, and as now it seems to be the case, then it would be easier for the police to catch those perpetrators before they actually have an attack.
Mm-hmm. And
We'll
very
see.
briefly, Professor Feng, you know, this kind of free transportation where everything is very easy, security check going to train stations, for instance, in many countries in Europe. Do you see that changing in the near future? Very briefly, please.
I have changed. You know, Europe used to be a very free place. You know, people easily get to trade. You know, get off the train, and nobody stops you. We have already saw this change. You know, more troops, surprisingly, you know, in Paris, in London. I guess it's going to be more.
Is that going to be the new
Paris,
normal also?
New normals as well.
Possibly.
Yes.
It's a sad possibility. Yeah. Anyway, many thanks to the two gentlemen, Francesco Sischi, Senior Researcher at the Center for European Studies of Renmin University, and Professor Feng Zhongping, Vice President at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. And my last point, as the events of recent weeks have shown, Europe is rapidly turning into a flashpoint in radical Islam's war with the West. There appear to be two main arguments for the causes. On the far right, former UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage believes there is a direct relationship between the number of people European countries let in from different cultures and the number of terror attacks. He pointed out to Fox News that IS terror attacks have not occurred in Central and Eastern Europe because those countries refuse to give in to EU quotas of migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean. But as the French newspaper Le Figaro pointed out, from 2011 to 2016, a total of 5,000 Europeans went to the Middle East to join the so-called jihad, and about 3,000 of them will come back home where they could launch attacks. So maybe the root solutions lies in working out why some people feel so marginalized, turn to extremist actions and spreading hate. In the short term, nothing much is likely to change, but without asking some very basic questions about the reasons people feel marginalized, Europeans may have to get prepared for living with sporadic terrorist attacks as a sad new normal. And that's it for this edition of The Point. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.